Good afternoon, good morning, good evening uh, on this fast forward planet, wherever you are. It's a turbulent planet these days. If you put the word flash flood into Twitter search box, you're just as likely to see the recent deadly toll in Turkey as the one right here in New York City, which was devastating. Still, families and communities uh, around the world grappling with water coming in unbelievable volumes sometimes. This is historically true. It's true because of the paving we've done all around our settlements, especially in urban areas. And it's getting truer in a heating climate, a human heated climate, where the atmosphere holds more moisture. So when a storm front collides with something appropriate, the rain that comes down can be heavier than it was before. I'm Andy Revkin, a longtime journalist covering climate, and at the Columbia Climate School, where I run the Sustain What webcast series. I'm very pleased to have some special guests on today to talk about how to really limit the odds that anyone will ever drown in a basement again. It just seems so utterly non-21st century to think in a world with satellites and buzzing phones and so much knowledge that we still end up with NYPD officers, as you can see here. This is one of the most wrenching scenes. It's not. This was where the couple and their toddler died underground in one of a couple 100,000 apartments that most of which are illegally converted to habitation because of a housing crunch in New York City that's been decades long. And so if you're an immigrant, if you're low income, your choices are pretty constrained. And in this case, so sadly constrained that they perished. They're among the 50 or so people in the New York region, New Jersey, those caught in cars, those in subterranean housing. And this just really feels like something we can do much more about. I'm hoping our guests today can help me figure out some ways to do that. And my focus, of course, is on communication strategies, but so much of this gets to what's happening or not happening on the ground in particular communities. It's a very granular form of communication that's needed. So let's meet our guests. And I think Andrew Kruszewicz from Columbia University will be coming on in a little bit too. But here, I'm very pleased to reconnect with Harold Brooks, with whom I've interacted with Harold most over the decades around tornadoes. He's at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, but he is deeply published on flash flooding too, which I only really realized after we exchanged some emails this morning. And the Severe Storms Lab, as we've discussed, is a very important enterprise. It's research center. It's not like the forecasting centers, National Weather Service and the like. But Harold, you're deeply dug in on this idea of flash floods. And a week ago, I had a session with Andrew Kruszewicz, who says, really, we haven't fully distinguished this as a phenomenon. In New York City, it was Sandy taught us about surge. Coastal flooding is more ingrained in FEMA maps, the disaster maps. It's like rivers and that. And Andrew said, you can basically have a flash flood anywhere. If you have too much rain falling on certain surfaces, this can happen. We have Laura Shepard, who's a bicycling advocate and bicyclist living in Queens in right near one of the areas that was devastated. And she posted a really compelling Twitter string last week that caught my attention. I'm going to be writing about taking us back in history and reminding us of the hydrological history under our feet in these urban areas that we miss too often as we go about daily life. And suddenly it emerges, kaboom. So it's great to have you here, Laura, from Queens, which is a big chunk of which is a disaster zone. So I hope you're doing okay.
Thank you.
And Erica Gies, who's a journalist, part of the Society of Environmental Journalists Network, where we discuss frequently on listserv questions of the day. And I was sifting for who's done a lot of writing on flooding risk. And of course, you have a book in the works and a hashtag to go with it, the hashtag being slow water, which is what flash floods are not. You're coming to us from Victoria, British Columbia. Great to have you here too.
Thank you.
So I thought maybe let's start with Laura. You're on the ground. You're here. You kind of represent the voice of the community, a community at risk And when these events unfolded, I'll point to the string in a minute. You started to pull together some really compelling, wrenching realities. I think you used the word infuriating more than once. And so, what has it felt like? Just give us a thumbnail sketch from Queens of how this played out and what hadn't happened that might have made a difference.
So it was pretty infuriating because all around we talk about climate change all the time. We talk about the strategies we can take to reduce emissions. We hit resistance politically and from our neighbors. And when we really felt the impacts, everybody just kind of went, oh, this is climate change. But the local impacts really could have been anticipated if there had been a broader understanding of local history, ecology, and hydrology in a number of places, it seems. And some of the consequences of our development patterns. The city was developed, large swaths of it, over a century ago. And so there are buildings, there's concrete, there's so much asphalt in places that were once waterways, wetlands, and all other surfaces that could have absorbed or retained water better. And in a lot of places, the people who live in the most precarious areas are low income, people of color, and it's infuriating to see these consequences. Generally, when people die, it's because a number of things went wrong. It's usually not random. It's a consequence.
Right.
And the fact that there were basement apartments on land that was once very close to a waterway and possibly wetlands shouldn't have happened.
It sure feels that way. And yet, as we'll discuss more, cities grow in ways that still too often seem oblivious to this underlying reality. I know Vancouver, not too far from Victoria, BC, they've been trying to daylight these streams. They've been taking what used to be buried sewers and uncovering them and making them into biologically functional streams. And even in Seoul, South Korea, I wrote a story more than 10 years ago, about how the city mayor had looked at the tangle of highways, the center of Seoul, and realized there was a stream under there too. That this is for aesthetic and environmental reasons. It was just completely forgotten, and they've taken it, rebirthed it, rewilded it, and it's created a safer flood zone as well. So that takes me to Erica. I think your book is about this kind of concept. Just here's one of the images from Laura's Twitter thread showing the map where this Peck Street, 153rd Street, was one of these really hammered places where several people died, right?
Yeah. Well, every single house on 153rd Street flooded. The deaths were at 15310 Peck.
Right. And as you can see here, you could describe, this was early in the 20th century, the same area.
Yeah, it looks like it was a giant pond. And gradually, over the next couple of decades, the water was rerouted. The area was filled in with landfill, much of it from the construction of the Long Island Expressway nearby.
So Erica, just talk a little bit about what led you to be a water-focused reporter, and how this resonates what you've been seeing this past week or so.
Yeah, actually, I got into covering water by covering energy. And when I realized more about the water energy nexus, how water and energy influence each other. But for the past 10 years or so, I've been focused pretty closely on water. And what Laura is describing about the development pattern in Queens is unfortunately incredibly common around the world. Humans really like flat areas to build in, and so around the world, people have built in floodplains, depriving water of the space it needs to absorb and overflow, and also in wetlands. 87% of the world's wetlands have been filled in since 1700. So, it's no surprise at all that we're having these kinds of flooding problems right now. And not that climate change and these big storms aren't a factor. Of course they are, but our development choices are making these problems so much worse. And in fact, this impacts water scarcity as well, because historically, this water would slow on the land and it would have time to infiltrate locally, and that would supply local wells and water. But instead, in our modern development, we have this tendency to really speed water off the land. We're afraid of flooding, get rid of it as quickly as possible. And then we have water shortages. And then, we think, we should bring in water from somewhere else, or we should desalinate water. But in fact, if we can make space for, what I'm calling slow water, which is restoring water's natural slow phases and making space for that. And that is difficult in an already developed city, but there are a lot of opportunities, both with disasters where you choose not to rebuild in place the same way, but also just from natural building turnover. We tend to think of our cities as sort of forever the way they are today. But in fact, building stock changes pretty rapidly, over decades. And so if a city can plan to sort of acknowledge, the people in my book are asking, what does water want and what did water do historically? So kind of the work that Laura has taken on in her neighborhood. And if you can find out where water goes and recreate, prioritize in your development that we're going to make space for that water, then, you can reduce some of these problems.
For sure. Harold, so back to you. A lot of what I'm hearing here also reminds me of the discussions we've had about tornadoes, which a whole other chunk of America, including places that are vulnerable to flash flooding, where the Stephen Strader and others have done all this mapped work showing we're building vulnerability to tornadoes way faster than we're changing the climate. And it gets me as a journalist always in this mode of, can we tell two stories at once? In other words, are we grown up enough as a species, as a society, to realize that vulnerability change is an on-the-ground responsibility that's largely neglected? And yes, we have to slow global warming too. It always seems to come down to, and here too, with flash flooding, I don't know how that plays out in your head on a day-to-day basis when people call you.
Fortunately, people don't call me that often about this, but I think one of the things is that for me, flash flooding is a particularly pernicious problem in a lot of ways. It's really difficult to forecast because we're worried about high rain rates and over short periods of time, and we worry about what happens when the water hits the ground. So it's not even just forecasting heavy rain; it's what's happening at the ground when the water gets there. And then it's also from a response standpoint, rain is so much more difficult, I think, for a lot of people to deal with. And I'll include myself in the list of people that find it difficult to deal with, because you're used to the fact that it rains, and sometimes it rains hard, and you kind of go, okay, I can deal with this. And then by the time when you actually realize, oh, this is a lot worse than normal, the flooding takes away the infrastructure. And so you lose all of your options of how to get it. That's why a lot of the, in some sense, that's why a lot of the automobile deaths occur, is that you're driving on a road you've driven on, every day for years, and all of a sudden the road isn't there anymore. And you're just acting like it's going to be the way it is. And that makes it really hard for people to respond in an appropriate time. And that's on the short time scale. The long-term planning time scale, obviously, where I live, if there's an inch of rain in a day, that actually my best way for my 2.5 mile trip to work, my 2.5 mile trip to work becomes a 3.5 mile trip to work, because there's one road that ponds really badly, and I don't really like going through it. And so, and but then when it gets to be a lot more rain than that, I really don't have as good of a measure for the impacts. I know that 1 inch we start to get the pound flooding. But when we got 3 or 4 inches in a day, like about 2 months ago, all of a sudden it was like, wow, this is a whole lot worse. And I really, I no longer even have that 3.5 mile option to go to work. It's now, well, let's just forget it if I wanted to go, because it's just not possible to get through there. And it's really hard to sort of understand that impact at a time that I can actually make decisions frequently.
Right. I was showing the Weather Channel a couple of years ago with some partners, did a pretty interesting visualization that they've used in some events now, showing, and that this reality I was reading on one of the NOAA websites about the power of moving water, and you're talking about a mass that's just extraordinary, and I guess that it becomes a creeping realization, as you were saying. I think that seems to be part of what happened in this case too.
Yeah, and I think one of the places that I started doing flash flood stuff based on a lot of what occurs in the valleys of the Rocky Mountains, where some of the big flash flood events, particularly the 70s, hit, and you can still go through the Big Thompson Canyon between Loveland and Estes Park, and you can actually still see markers on the canyon walls of where the water got to, because it essentially stripped all the lichen off. And so you can see it takes about 100 years for the lichen to grow back. Probably a lot of it's grown back since the last time I was in the canyon now, but it would still be visible. And you can see people have built houses, and the roof line is below the lichen line. And you're going, if it happens again, it's probably not going to be a very good outcome here.
So Erica, I don't want to spill the beans on your book too much, but when I see Andrew Krashevitz is coming in too in a second, we'll get him in just a minute. Is your book more of a warning or more of a prescription, or is it narrative? When you think about all this, the knowledge, how this kind of flood is particularly tough, and that the vulnerability reduction is really at the block by block scale, almost to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And Erica, in your book, like, how are you parsing this out? Where does the responsibility really lie?
This book is a solutions journalism, I would say. So I have gone to different places around the world who are really leaders in incorporating nature-based solutions to better managing water, and that are attempting to do it at some kind of scale, because that's really important. Sometimes people are like, oh, look, we daylighted this, 1,000 feet of creek, but we're still having flooding. But of course, you can't expect like one small dam to supply water to Los Angeles, or one small levee to protect St. Louis. It's a landscape scale solution that's needed, because we need to make space for water across the land. And so there are places like China and Sponge Cities that's trying to implement this in scale, or Peru, which has a natural infrastructure for water security, where people's water bills are actually going to invest in natural infrastructure. Of course, the Dutch have been leaders with this, with their Room for River. And, California has some leadership in terms of storing water underground. So there are a lot of different beavers. Beavers are very important for storing water on the landscape, both for preventing floods, which is what they're being used for in England, and for storing water for drought, which is how they're being used in the American West, also as fire breaks. So yeah, I think in terms of who's responsible for implementing this, of course, it's complicated. And, you know, there are various disincentives often for developers to make money that lead to poor planning and ignoring this kind of intervention. But I think a bigger problem is probably this kind of culture of concrete that has developed over the last, 150, 200 years, and our attitude of trying to control water. And that's why my book is called Water Always Wins, because sooner or later it does. We can't control it. Right. And the more that we can make space for it and accommodate what it wants to do, the happier we'll be.
So let me bring Andrew in here too. He was on just a week ago talking about some of these issues. And Andrew has a NASA. Here's Andrew Krushevitz from Columbia University Climate School, who's very busy right now. He has a NASA grant to improve flash flood capacity for flash flood forecasting and monitoring at the global scale, and has been thinking a lot about this ecosystem of change. He lives in Brooklyn, right?
Yes,
near the Gowanus Canal. Near an area where this was also hit. And so, Andrew, in the last week, what has come to mind that as you're thinking about these urgent questions? Well, when we were talking last week, you made some of the points that Laura has made in her Twitter string, that this is really about the vulnerability for the vulnerable. People who are marginal to begin with are almost always, except maybe commuters caught in cars. There are some leveling landscapes here, but at least for this urban issue, how can we prevent people drowning in basements?
So everything Andy said, it's been a complicated week on a few fronts. Luckily, we were okay here in Gowanus, but the neighborhood, there was a lot of impact. But yeah, I mean, it's tough when, especially the specific hazard that you study impacts you right at home. I mean, New York, no one really thought about flash floods prior to today, or we could say prior to this year. I do think that there has been many flash flood warnings. Well, I know there's been many flash flood warnings this year in New York City and the region. Unfortunately, that means there's been many mostly ignored flash flood warnings. I mean, even myself, I mean, it's hard to know what to do and how to react to those things. We've seen repeated images and videos of the subways flooding over the past few months. I had a couple of colleagues from overseas write me messages. They're like, "Wow, we didn't realize last week's flash flood was a new thing, because we've seen so many images of flooded subways." They're like, "What is happening?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's happening a lot." And yet, flash flood risk still is a largely neglected risk here in New York City and in many places. So I try to think it has. I don't want to say that it's not impacting me personally and professionally and very stressful. It is. I think it's important for scientists to say that too, especially when these disasters impact where you live. However, I'm also trying to think of positive ways forward. I think it's important. And I think one of my favorite things about living in New York is we have the tools. We have various elements that we could call on, and we have the experience of building back after an event. And I'm referring to Sandy. I mean, after Sandy, there was a lot of discussions. There were task force, there were community groups, there were grants for research, reflections on policies. All these things happened. And I know we could do that for Ida, and we should do that for Ida. I mean, we're looking now at estimates of impact from Ida. It's in the 50, 60 billion range. That's going to put it in the top 10 storms of all time. So I think I'm trying to think a lot now about why have many of us forgotten about Ida already? I was living in New York, also in a flood zone, a different flood zone in Greenpoint during Sandy, which also got flooded. And after that, there was a lot of discussion right away, and more outrage, I guess, from people. Why did this happen? Why am I waiting 2 hours, 3 hours to get gas? And I think because we saw the localized impact, and we didn't see Wall Street shut down, or we didn't see the impacts on the shocks in the economic sector like we did during Sandy. We didn't have the personal impacts of subway shut down for a long period of time or lack of gas. I'm afraid we're going to forget that Ida even happened, and then what happened? And then what? So what can we do to use this as a teachable moment from each, like the science research side, the policy side, and then also the practice of issuing warnings and doing something about it. I don't know. That's to answer your question, Andy. Those are the things I'm thinking about. It's definitely not about the science. It's about trying to put it all together into something where we could actually do something next time.
And Laura and maybe Erica too on this. One of the things that happens after disasters, when this money flows or these new plans emerge, there is a bias, implicit bias in our systems for that spending to go to protect things that are valuable, meaning things that are already valuable in the economy, which is not necessarily basement dwelling people who are at the margins of the economy. And I don't know how that plays forward. You look at there was this big U proposed around Lower Manhattan, protecting Wall Street from the next Sandy. But I remember at the time writing and hearing from people saying, what's it doing for the low-lying areas of other parts of the city? And again, that doesn't even get at this non-coastal flood risk. Maybe Laura, what's going on the in the community scale there? I've seen some wonderful reporting from the city and some local media outlets on making this point, but what's it feel like?
Right now, the main concern is that a lot of our neighbors lost everything.
Right.
All of their possessions got not just wet, but a lot of it was sewage. So much had to be tossed. When you go to these blocks right now, people have clothes and shoes drying outside that they've tried to sanitize. Some framed photos that were on walls survived, but whole appliances floated and trucks have had to come around to pick them up. And a lot of these people are recent immigrants who have, when they moved to New York, they started over, and now they have to do it all over again. So using this money to make these people whole again, to help them find safe, stable housing, ideally near the communities and services that they need. That's what's important in the short term. In the long term, there's a whole discussion about basement apartments in general, and the fact that some of these apartments weren't safe because homeowners and tenants just couldn't access any kind of funding that would make them safe, to upgrade the electrical systems or fully waterproof them, whatever it takes. So having clearer policies that would make it possible for people to bring safe basement apartments up to code would be important. But also, on top of a former waterway or a wetland, it seems like it's also really important to just say, no, you cannot have people living in the basement here. That doesn't make sense. But making sure that people have places to go that are safe. As for this land in particular, realize these homes are worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and to buy them all out, to make it parkland and to really restore it all would cost a fortune. And we would have to, evaluate whether that investment would be worthwhile in the long run, or if that's even what the residents want. I don't want to speak for them.
Sure. No, we had two conferences at Columbia the last 3 years on what's called managed retreat. Mm-hmm. And what are the dynamics you can facilitate to shape neighborhoods and communities for the long haul, in some cases with buyouts, in some cases with other incentives. But it's really tough, and it's mostly social, political issues, not science. The work that Harold does and that Andrew does with the satellites kind of lays out the landscape, but the social scientists and community interface folks are so critical going forward. Andrew, I know you deal with that even in Bangladesh and Rohingya refugee camps, and
Yeah.
Is that capacity to help communities navigate those decisions adequately invested in?
I don't think it's capacity. I actually think we overuse, or we recklessly use the word capacity building. I think there's times where we could provide support, but I think it's naive to think the provision of support or like technical backstopping is the same as building capacity. I mean, this is something that I didn't really expect when beginning my work in the humanitarian sector, that there's these terms that get used. But I do think there's value, and I think if the scientist understands the responsibility and the privilege in engaging in these contexts, like Rohingya refugee camp operations, where I was working, then I think it's possible. But I think that's an important part of this story of integrating data into decision making. Like better response, better preparedness to disasters. I think scientists need to acknowledge the responsibility and, again, the privilege of being able to do so. And I think it's the same in working in the U.S. context as well, especially in cities where you have such tight gradients of vulnerability from block to block. Just because you're from New York doesn't mean you understand every part of East New York or South Bronx. I mean, it's very difficult. And one of the similarities I find with like flash flood preparedness or any disaster preparedness action here in the city compared to the refugee camp is like there's neighborhoods. Then the refugee camp, there was 800,000 people. All of them were the most vulnerable by definition. In New York City, there's neighborhoods where many, if not all, people would be defined as the most vulnerable. However, if we have minimal resources or just constrained resources to do something, how do you identify who is the most vulnerable out of the most vulnerable? And that's a super difficult concept to even process. But like in many ways, that's what we're faced with again and again when we see disasters impacting the most vulnerable. It's not just saying, do something in that neighborhood. Like there is a need many times for more specificity, and that's very difficult. And sometimes the data that we have does not help us to make that decision. It's really about connecting with community leaders and community members to understand that. And again, it's sometimes very impossible for scientists to build that level of trust to get there. So I think scientists need to understand that. And also understand when maybe it's not best to get involved. Maybe when disseminating a warning or a map doesn't actually help and it actually hurts the situation.
That's interesting too. Erica, in your reporting, are there characteristics of communities that are the places where you're seeing sort of a solutions orientation? Is there some particular character to the communities that you find?
Well, I think there have been some studies on cities in the Midwest who chose to relocate completely. Nicholas Pinter out of UC Davis has done some really interesting work looking at, what does it take for a community to decide, we want to do something different. We want to prepare better for the future and make ourselves more resilient. Another person who's done a lot of work on managed retreat is A.R. Siders. I believe she's out of Rutgers. And, she cited to me a study, I think it was by the Union of Concerned Scientists, about how much it would cost to relocate. I was thinking of Laura's comment in terms of like how valuable these houses are. And in fact, to relocate all of the houses at flood risk in the United States is in the low trillions. So that's a lot of money. But when we're talking about these $1 trillion bills that are passing through Congress, I mean, this is something that the United States could afford to do if it chose to prioritize that. And I worry that in these conversations that we're having about infrastructure, there's so much kind of Monday morning quarterbacking that's happening. And you see that in New York with the way people have tried to plan in response to Sandy, that problem was storm surge. And so people were like, let's build a big seawall. But of course, if you think about what water wants and how water acts, it doesn't just come from the sea. It also comes from below. It comes from the sky. And so these kind of, I think of a lot of engineering infrastructure solutions as sort of single problem solution focused. But when you're working in a complex system, a single problem solution is going to cause a lot of unintended consequences. And so, thinking more holistically, more creatively about what infrastructure means and how we want to use this funding, I think, we can't just keep fiddling around the edges, right? We need to dramatically change how we're doing things.
So I apologize. I have to jump in because I have to meet with students.
Sure.
I feel bad, but I'm happy, Andy. Thanks for the last minute invite, and I'm happy just to jump in. And I feel bad to jump out, but we just started the semester, so there's a lot going on.
Yeah. No.
So I'm very glad to be connected and nice to meet you. But thanks, Andy, and hope we could keep the discussion going.
And hopefully this percolates into the classrooms and they come up with some good ideas too.
Definitely. Okay.
Thank you again. We are all, it's a busy day. I'm overloaded with trying to write up some of these themes, but I wanted to maybe focus for another couple minutes on next steps. There's one thing I proposed on Twitter that I think is worth examining here. I haven't heard a hard no yet. I talked to a lot of people about this, including disaster folks. So let me just show it and we'll talk about it. I made a little graphic using pieces of two things. I've written a lot about earthquakes over the last 2 decades, since the tsunami of 2004 in the Indian Ocean, which I've covered extensively, and many, many other, actually before then too. And we have a norm of great shakeout, third Thursday of October, and now it's international. It's in many, many states, even across the Midwest, where they have that rare but calamitous earthquake risk, the New Madrid Fault seismic zone. There are states like Mississippi and Arkansas and Illinois that are doing the annual shakeout. And I wonder that these are landscapes that also have flood risk, yet we still have people driving into dangerous waters, and we still have communities where with maybe a half hour more awareness, someone upstairs might say to someone downstairs, come on up. And is there something we can do behaviorally? Is there a great dry out? Or Ilan Kelman, who's a disaster expert in London, he thinks we should have a vulnerability out. What we need is to shake all the vulnerability, because again, poverty puts everybody at risk. So I just don't know. Is this something that makes sense? Harold, you've been involved in a lot of the discussions around how do you turn data into response. So what do you think?
Well, I think it's possible. I don't know how to design it. I mean, that's obviously the problem. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time today talking about is how's New York responding to what's going on. In reality, another big question is, well, how's Philadelphia responding?
Right.
They didn't get flooded this time, but it's pretty hard to believe that they don't have pretty much close to the exact same risk. And right. It's we tend to do things when something happens to us or very, very near us, as opposed to, we got lucky this time and it wasn't us. Maybe we should do something before it is our turn. And I think that's right. One of the real challenges we face is as I read flash flood stories from around the world, almost everybody says there's always a story that I have something like, I've lived here for X number of decades, and it's never been like this before. Well, and there's in one sense, there's a pretty good reason. The fact that if that happened all the time, you really wouldn't live there. And you go up the canyons of in the Rockies, and you go, well, this one's had a recent flash flood. The next one hasn't. The next one down has. It's like, well, there's no reason to think the one in the middle, its turn hasn't come yet. And yet people will imagine that they're somehow invulnerable there. And so I think one of our big challenges, and maybe something like this could help, is getting people to understand that flash floods happen everywhere. And just because you didn't get flooded doesn't mean your turn won't come. And that's, I think, the biggest message is, how do we get people to understand that it doesn't have to happen to you before you start doing something about it.
That reminds me of tornado preparedness too, because tornado warnings, are for a region. They're never like for a block. And you could end up with a perception of, if it didn't hit you, it hit Moore, Oklahoma instead of Norman, Oklahoma, that you're safe.
I can introduce you to a number of people.
Been a lot of lessons. Sorry.
I can introduce you to a lot of people who will say exactly that. So.
Yeah, I'm sure. Sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, I like the idea of having just clear comms, because I think something that really went wrong here was the notifications only came out in English, as far as I know. And this is a diverse, multilingual community where possibly not everyone had a working smartphone. People work really long hours. A big question a lot of people were asking was, why didn't the food delivery apps shut down during this? People were wading through, waist-high water with walking their e-bikes to deliver for Grubhub in the middle of the flash flood. It made no sense. And we were also like, who is ordering? And what is wrong with them?
I think there is a sense in which people, from a psychological perspective, do kind of continue to do what they're planning, like those people in the subway who are just like looking at their phones, waiting for the subway to come while the water is cascading down the stairs. And, there's a lot that's been done in behavioral science in terms of people's ability to sort of process climate change and response to it. And I think this is another facet that needs more study, or perhaps it's been done and I'm just not that familiar with it. But like how people do sort of have this pre-setting to just sort of like continue with life as normal. And I think that will change somewhat when people experience more disasters and so are, more aware, like people in earthquake country. Like, I grew up in California and we have always known that you should get under something. So, as people experience these things, that kind of knowledge will spread. But I think there is also something in human psychology about like, oh, I'm trying to get to my meeting. I'm going to continue to try to get to my meeting. So I think we need to look at that and the best ways to address that. And I just want to add one quick thing about Hal's mention of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia actually is a leader in low impact development, which is like absorbing stuff. And their motivation is because they had a lot of combined sewer overflows, and that was a pollution problem. And so they're trying to absorb more rain on site. And I don't know if their program is widespread enough yet to make a significant difference in the kind of rain that, we saw recently with Ida, but it would be interesting to see, how well their adaptations are working so far for something like that.
Well, there's lots more to explore here, maybe in future episodes, definitely when your book comes out. There is a floodlist.com website that keeps track of the global scale of things. And here's the most recent updated map. This is just through July, and you can see lots of incidents around the world. One of the paradoxes this past week was the same day that the flooding surged in New York City was when the World Meteorological Organization put out its report of an atlas of the last 50 years of weather disasters. And overall, the world is doing better. We have many more people than we did 50 years ago, 4 billion, now at 8 billion. And deaths have remarkably declined. So at the macro scale, the human enterprise is doing really well. And I guess this gets us back finally to the vulnerability part. And if more can be done to facilitate getting people out of harm's way who are at that most vulnerable scale, it feels like some significant progress could be made. This doesn't get at the point Laura made about property, but at least on lives, there's a huge amount that can be done. Thank you all for being here today. It's a Friday and a very hectic time, and you all have lots to do. And I'd love to revisit these issues perhaps going forward. So thanks to Andrew Krushevitz, who was here earlier. Laura Shepard, thank you so much for being an active social media presence on these issues. I think that gives me hope, and otherwise there's so much less that people would understand about what's going on in the local scale. Harold Brooks, keep up the great work you're doing on risky weather and climate change and building the baseline that we can all operate on, at least hopefully. And Erica Gies, journalist, thank you again for your work. And I look forward to your book. And everyone should follow your hashtag slow water. We all need to find ways to slow water down. And that's a great starting point. This is Sustain What, the Columbia University Climate School enterprise I started on the early days of the pandemic and can't avoid keeping doing it. You can read what I'm writing at revkin.bulletin.com, and these can be shared as soon as we're done. So thank you all for being here today. Stay safe.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.